Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Good afternoon. My name is Veronica Dunlap. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the National Network for Safe Communities. And I am so happy that you all will be joining us today for our Police Community Reconciliation Symposium, Healing the Harm of Racialized Policing. I'm just going to give a few house notes and then we will begin our program. If you could please silence your cell phones. We also encourage you to tweet, to take pictures. Please use the hashtag #HealingBeginsHere. Again, that's hashtag #HealingBeginsHere. And I want to say good afternoon to our audience who is joining us via live stream. We're happy that you're joining us as well. And there's one small change to the program. The final panel will be moderated by our Group Violence Intervention Director, Luisa Aviles. If you could all help me in welcoming our director, David M. Kennedy.
So Luisa is filling in for me at the last panel of the day because unfortunately my participation today is brought to you by Dayquil. I am not at my best today, and Luisa, thanks for filling in. Welcome to John Jay. I am the director of the National Network for Safe Communities. The NNSC is your host today. We are deeply, deeply, deeply pleased and honored that our work has gotten to a point with the help of many, many, many others that we're able to have the discussion that we're going to have today. The National Network is a hands-on, on-the-ground, applied violence prevention shop. So we are a part of John Jay, which is a fine college, and CUNY, which is a fine university, and we do all those academic things. For us, it is all in the service of applied work on the ground with real people in real places. And we think that this engagement with history, with race, with the reality of the American experience, and with addressing it squarely is one of the most important things that we could be part of. And we're delighted that we're at a point that we can be here with you today. Our work in this has been an extended enterprise, but it got a real boost over the last 5 years because of our participation in something framed out of the last administration, the Justice Department, continued in this administration, called the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. It was focused expressly on the civil rights crisis of our day, which is criminal justice and criminal justice reform, and particularly police community relations. In that, it had 3 planks in 6 cities. We worked on procedural justice, we worked on implicit bias, and it gave us an opportunity to think and act in a very pragmatic way about what police community reconciliation would look like. And I want to thank some people. So my former college president here at John Jay, Jeremy Travis, now with Arnold Ventures, framed up the idea for what became the National Initiative and took it to the Justice Department. It was heard there at the time in primary part by one Carol Mason. And Carol Mason made this happen at the Justice Department and then came to John Jay and is our current college president here at John Jay, where she continues to care deeply about this portfolio. And in the National Network, the National Initiative work was done by a number of extraordinarily talented and dedicated people, some of whom are working on this still and who are with us today. So I'd like all the folks from the National Network who have been part of the national initiative to stand up for a second. They literally have gotten us to the point that we can do this work today. So let's get on with it. Thank you very much.
So we're here to talk about why reconciliation, why now? And we have with us today, of course, David M. Kennedy, we have Andrea Blackman, Jesse Jeanette, and Evan Lewis. And if you could all just take a moment to introduce yourselves and tell me very briefly how you are connected to this work.
Thank you. I'm Andrea Blackman, and I work for the Nashville Public Library. For the past 16 years, I've led programs and projects that bring community members, law enforcement, and just the general lay together in a public library. So my job is to bridge 1954, post-Brown, to 2019 and shed light and give our community introspective opportunities to look at past injustices and how they parallel with today.
I'm Jesse Janetta. I'm a senior policy fellow at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., and we have the privilege of being the evaluation partner for the national initiative work that David mentioned. And so our charge was in that learning project that was trying new things as well as combining things that already existed in new ways to help create and bring forth the knowledge that was being gathered from that in Stockton, community you'll be hearing from, as well as Fort Worth, Minneapolis, Gary, Indiana, Pittsburgh, and Birmingham.
And I'm Evan Lewis. I am a development consultant and have spent the bulk of the past 12 to 15 years or so building and supporting educational institutions that work directly with communities of color. But I am more personally connected to this work through my great-grandfather, Lynch Shaw, who was lynched in Georgia in 1936 in a pretty gruesome and sort of emblematic moment, at least as it relates to lynching history in this country. And as you all may hear later, the story has some really interesting implications for policing and for relations between the police and communities of color.
Thank you. So David, NNSC has been conducting groundbreaking, evidence-based work for decades now. And as we officially mark our 10th anniversary, we're embarking on this journey that some call trust building, collective healing, reconciliation, community restorative justice. It seems to have risen to the surface across the country, not only in New York or in the criminal justice circle, but in other circles as well. Where did it begin for you, and why now for the country?
Well, it began with me in what continues to be my primary focus. So I'm a communities guy. And in my way, I'm a crack baby. I'm here because 30 years ago I got drawn into research that was putatively focused on policing, but in the mid-'80s at the time, the crack epidemic was spreading from west to east across the country, and in my work on policing, I ended up walking crack markets for the next 10 years. And I've learned to say I was walking crack markets in a professional capacity, unlike the other white folks I saw in the crack markets. And the community conditions were appalling, and my presence in this world began then and really continues the focus that communities deserve a threshold level of public safety and domestic tranquility. And in the social science on this, there is now a dominant idea of legitimacy. And legitimacy is the faith and the conviction that the public has in the police and the agents of the state to be fair and just and effective and to play that role. And there is big news to everybody here in this room. There is a crisis of legitimacy between many American communities and the police. That is a crisis that did not begin recently, right? So we're in New York City, and the recent history of New York City is one of debate about stop and frisk and all that kind of thing. That crisis did not begin with zero tolerance. It didn't begin with the rise of mass incarceration. I work primarily in Black American communities. And the history of those communities with the power of the state begins before there was a country. It begins with transportation. This is the foundation of the colonies, was the slave trade. It is built into the founding of the nation. It's the 3/5 compromise and blacks as property. It is the long, awful sweep of slavery in which white folks could and did do anything to black folks that they wanted under color of law. It is the Civil War and Reconstruction and the taking back of all those gains under color of law and the creation of the prison labor system, especially in the South, and separate but equal, and Jim Crow, and Brown v. Board Ed, and everything that goes through the sweep of the 19th century into the police setting dogs and fire hosers on civil rights workers, the formal gains of the 1960s, which is when we begin the changes in criminal justice policy, the war on drugs, the war on crime, that we now know are the beginning of the modern era of mass incarceration, where legal scholar Paul Butler has shown that it's more likely today that a black man will spend time in prison under the current colorblind system than before the reforms of the 1960s. So this is the awful experience of one American community with the power of the state under color of law. And each harmed people has its own story like this. And it is so serious and so dire, and the collective impact and the collective memory is so powerful that we believe that it deserves the kind of attention that others have given to things like this in the wake of apartheid in South Africa and transitional justice situations. The country ought to treat this as the sin that it is and to take it seriously. And we find, thankfully, that there are police figures and others in positions of privilege and authority who are willing to do this work, and it's time to do it.
Thank you. And as we heard, David talked a bit about the history of not only racial violence in the country, but how it relates to policing. And on that note, Andrea, history plays a crucial role in the framework for Police Community Reconciliation Initiative. And what do you believe is the impact of history on policing today, specifically with regard to communities of color and the work that you do?
Just listening to what David was saying as it relates to history and the founding of this country, and most of the greatest impact that has been ignored or not part of our everyday language has been this idea of fear and this low-grade trauma. And we associate low-grade trauma and fear with any other period of time. But when we think about modern policing, the impact is still fear, it's still trauma, it's still oppression, it's still who has the burden and who carries the burden of reconciliation, who carries the burden of restorative practices in communities. And so I think that the greater impact is that idea of fear, oppression, low-grade trauma, and being able to say those words and making it part of our everyday language in 2019. Because it's easy for us to talk about trauma and oppression as it relates to slavery or a chattel system or a caste system. But when we think about policing in 2019, those words still have to be just as impactful.
Absolutely. And Andrea, following that line and impact, if you could please describe for us some of the work that you do with regard to history and with police departments.
Sure. So for the past, I would say 5 years, we have worked deliberately in connecting our local law enforcement and our statewide level commission agents to bring them into a physical space that is a replica of 1950 and 1960. So when the new cadets walk in, they are actually sitting at a lunch counter with oversized black and white images of water hoses or of Congressman John Lewis standing at a lunch counter. And so they are immersed in history for at least 3.5 hours for the first session. And so we look at these images and we juxtapose 1957, 1960, 2019, and we ask the cadets, what was the role of law enforcement in 1950? And how do you define yourself now as guardian? And so all of our local law enforcement agencies, their cars have protector and guardian on top of them. And so one of the questions that I love to ask is, so how did the police respond as a guardian and as a protector in 1957? Because one of the beautiful things about Nashville and its civil rights legacy is that many of the freedom riders, many of the local activists are still alive and still very adamant about making sure that a city doesn't forget its own local narrative and that we are rediscovering and uncovering new narratives. And so the local law enforcement have the opportunity to spend time juxtaposing history and asking some very tough questions of themselves, looking at black and white images, listening to oral histories, or just digging into those archives and looking at police records. And Jesse and I were talking about those police records earlier and asking very tough questions. So what does it mean to be a protector, a guardian of law and justice, or what is civil in 2019? So that's the work that we've been doing for the past 5 years.
And so it's interesting because you're talking about the tough questions that you ask, and I want to stick with this for just a moment because I'm sure that our audience is curious. What reactions do you get from the cadets or from the officers who go through this training? How do they approach it?
And so one of the things we're utilizing is this idea, we're utilizing the Socratic method, and we're asking them to analyze. And 95% of our new recruits are white males, but they're all under the age of 50. And so they are so far removed mentally and thinking about 1950. And so their first response was, that isn't me, and that's not my story, nor is that my narrative. And then we push a little bit harder, but what is your personal responsibility? Because if you look at the trauma within black communities, and particularly any community, but I'll just use Nashville, and you have 16 freedom riders living in one segment of the city, when you are policing that city, these are people who put their lives on the line, who wrote out their wills at the age of 17, who said they would die in the face of Bull Connor and a water hose. And so, but you see them as just being an older black man. And so we see the shift in perception and attitudes over a period of time. It doesn't happen in the first 3 to 5 hours of our sessions, but we see these local law enforcement cadets saying, oh, this wasn't me, but what is now my personal responsibility, even if it means going against this ingrained idea of what policing was.
Thank you. So Jesse, I want to turn to you because we're talking about reactions and outcomes to this sort of work, and you partnered very closely, the Urban Institute did, with NNSC, with the National Initiative work, and some of that looked at reconciliation processes that had been instituted to some degree in 6 pilot cities across the country. And so what I would like you to talk about a bit is, what did you find in your evaluations, and what are some of the implications of those findings?
Sure. So, what I'd like to start with is talking a little bit about some work that in many ways was an input to the reconciliation process. So as part of our evaluation, one of the things we did in all 6 of the cities that I mentioned is go deliberately to the communities that we identified that had the highest levels of crime and concentrated poverty, and in many cases, the most vexed history with law enforcement, and go out and ask people sort of how they viewed the police, their level of trust, and things like that. And just, to name a few of the things that we found there across the 6 cities, talking to residents of those neighborhoods, half of them agreed or believed that police act based on their personal prejudices or bias. Just 24% of them agree that the police are honest. Just the same percentage, a little less than a quarter, agree that police departments hold officers accountable for wrong and inappropriate conduct. Just 30% of the residents that we surveyed agreed that the police treat people with dignity and respect. And there was a long litany of things that we were collecting data on. And I think that those were realities that many people in those communities were very well versed in. It didn't need anyone to tell them that. But I will say that when we briefed out and talked to the police leadership about those findings, the fact that those problems existed was not news to them. I mean, they were engaging in an effort to address those very issues. But I will say they found the extent of the mistrust and skepticism about policing that we were reporting to them bracing, and in some cases I would say pretty shocking. And I think that did provide additional impetus to this question, and something also to take to their officers about why deliberately going at reconciliation as a goal was an important thing to undertake. I can report that after 2 years of the National Initiative's work, we went back to the same communities, asked the same questions. In 2017, we found statistically significant improvements on all of the things that I mentioned, and a variety of other ones. A lot can happen in 2 years. Many things happened in those communities other than the National Initiative, not to mention all the things that were happening nationally. But one of the questions that we came into this is how much change is even possible, how fast in sort of community perceptions of police, how much reconciliation can happen. And well, we don't have a definitive or necessarily a causal answer. I think that what we have is very promising. The other thing that I will say, we interviewed many people across all 6 of the cities that were involved in the reconciliation activities in the National Initiative. There are a lot of very, interesting, I think, important themes. But a couple that I will mention, the reconciliation work began with a public and deliberate acknowledgement of harm by police leadership, talking about history, the specific history of those communities. That seemed to be tremendously important to people in the communities who heard that, although it also raised the challenge because they wanted to make sure, and we heard this from community residents across all 6 of the cities, the history is important here, and that's the through line, but also what is happening now and harms that are happening now are important. So this is not a historical issue. This is a history including the present issue. And the other thing that I would name is, for a lot of folks on both the community and police side, doing work around reconciliation, it's such a big word. It opened up a lot of questions just conceptually about what they were trying to do here. And I was struck in particular by how similarly people, again, across these 6 very different cities asked, what do we mean by reconciliation? It contains this idea of restoring a past state, whether it's of right relationships. And many people said in very similar terms, we have never had in our community a correct relationship with law enforcement where we feel they protect it. We've never had that. So it's not a matter of restoring it. It's a matter of trying to create something here that we've never had. And the fact that people, and again, on both the police and community side, came to such a similar way of articulating the challenge of even getting their heads around what it meant to do reconciliation work in this area was very striking to us.
Thank you. And so, continuing along that line of not only impact, but what does reconciliation mean if the relationship in some communities doesn't seem to feel like it was ever in a good place? Evan, I heard your story in New Orleans, the story of your ancestor, and it would seem to me that your family would be one of the groups that say, we've never had this correct relationship. If you could please share with the audience the story that you shared with us, and then what impact that had on your relationship or your family's relationship with law enforcement.
Sure. I guess we'll start in 1936. Maybe shortly prior to that. My great-grandfather, as I mentioned, Lynch Shaw, was lynched in Colbert, Georgia, which is a small town kind of just outside of Athens, Georgia, where the University of Georgia is located. Lynch was a sharecropper. He was a long-term and long-time resident of the community in which he lived and raised a family, and was ultimately murdered by his fellow citizens. Right. Lynch was a sharecropper who had a large family, 11 children, including quite a few sons. In those times, given sort of the agrarian sort of economic system that existed in that area, having such a large family and having so many able-bodied sons in his household meant that he was able to acquire a measure of resources, wealth, and in some ways, I guess, a measure of power that was a bit uncommon for a black man in his community at that time. He was able to strike a deal at some point with a white gentleman in the community to buy some land. He purchased the land, and he began to, again, accumulate some measure of wealth. I don't want to overstate it, but he definitely began to build a life for himself and his family that kind of extended past the boundaries that were considered acceptable for black folks at that time. The white gentleman that Lynch purchased his land from was sickly, was on his deathbed. He ultimately died, and after his death, his sons decided that they wanted that land back. And so they sort of embarked on a campaign to reclaim and recapture that land. That campaign ultimately led to Lynch being lynched in one of the more, sort of emblematic instances of lynching of that time. In the aftermath of the lynching, my great-grandmother and all of her children were quickly sort of ushered out of the city, were told in no uncertain terms that they were never to return. All of his sons were actually kind of walked out to the body, shown the body that was mutilated and bullet-ridden, and he was castrated. And they were told again in no uncertain terms, Lynch Shaw is the last Shaw that will live in this area. You all are to leave, you all are to get out, and should you ever return, then the same sort of fate will befall you. And so I was raised on the south side of Chicago, and this is sort of the story of how my family landed on the south side of Chicago. And so that's kind of the bare bones sort of skeleton of the story of Lynch lynching. But as I've come to discover through what now amounts to years of sort of exploration and research, is that this is kind of just the beginning of the story as it relates to my family's, kind of further development from that point on. My family goes from being a land-owning family in rural Georgia to living in the projects of Chicago. Like many folks who moved to Chicago and other northern cities, during the Great Migration, both the first and the second wave, interactions with the police kind of continued to be an issue. But certainly, my great-grandfather's lynching is kind of the most striking and tragic example of that. At least one of the men who lynched Lynch, we now know, was a police officer who was later named chief of police in the community. This was years after the lynching. A gentleman by the name of Early Elder. So as it relates to reconciliation, as it relates to what that means, it's a huge, as Jesse said, it's a huge word, and so by extension, this is a pretty big question that you're posing. And so I don't know that I know what reconciliation means to me. I don't know that I can say what it means to my family, but it does, at the very least, imply a public and sort of affirmative acknowledgement of the lynching and of all that happens in the aftermath of the lynching. I think I find myself in settings like this with a fair amount of frequency as of late, and one of the things that's always striking to me is the way that what we talk about when we talk about reconciliation often feels deeply impersonal. It often feels, and for that reason, in some ways it feels, less than satisfying, right? Because when I talk about reconciliation, I'm talking about not even so much, Lent and his life, but the life of my great-grandmother in the aftermath, right? Having to raise 11 children, having to relocate a family of 11 children from a rural setting into an urban setting, and all that goes along with that, right? When I talk about reconciliation, I mean, I'm talking about having fairly recently kind of deathbed conversations with my great aunt Reba, who was Lynch Shaw's last living child, who, was comatose, and I'm in her hospital room, and she's completely out, and this is during the time when I'm beginning to do some of the research and beginning to get more answers about what happened to my great-grandfather. And when someone is in a coma and when they're kind of in those last stages, you sit there and you speak to them and you talk to them and you hope that they can hear and you hope that they can kind of take in what it is that you're saying, but you don't always quite know. And one of the things that I told her was that I had been back to Colbert. I was the first member of my family to return to Colbert in the 80 or so years since Lent's lynching. And I told her that we were beginning to get answers about what happened to her father. We were beginning to get information about the folks who were responsible and kind of what frankly amounts to a broad sort of community-wide conspiracy that leads to a lynching and then covers up a lynching in its aftermath, right? And at that moment, she opens her eyes for the first time in the 10 or so minutes that I'd been there with her. I wish that I could tell you all that I think that she opened her eyes because she was proud of me and because she was proud of the work that I was doing and because she was proud of the new information that we were getting and because she felt like we were reaching a moment of closure. But again, to address this idea of fear, what I really believe is that she opened her eyes because she was fearful. Right? I can recall being a young man applying to colleges across the nation and applying to and being admitted to Morehouse and having my great aunt, another of Lent's daughters, sit me down and make it clear to me in no uncertain terms that Morehouse wasn't an option for me because Georgia isn't an option for our family. Because that is the sort of legacy that historical terror has on families and on individuals. And so I don't quite know, again, what reconciliation means for me, how it would impact me, how it would impact my family, but I do know that in order for it to have an impact, in order for it to have real, true meaning, and in order for there to be reconciliation, then there has to be truth-telling. There has to be honesty. As is often the case, when you start telling truth, You might solve one problem, but you are oftentimes creating 10 more. And so we all also have to summon the resolve and muster the strength and the courage, not just to speak to the historical harms and the present harms, but also to be willing to deal with what is surely coming after that. Because, so many of us truly, honestly, legitimately don't know our history. But so many of us truly, honestly, really would rather not know our history as well. That frankly hasn't been an option for my family. It hasn't been an option for me. And if I am an American, if I am a citizen, then part of what that means is that it's not an option for any of us. I don't know if that fully addresses your question, but that's the best I got.
It is, thank you. And I think this is a good point to turn back to David and say, at NNSC, again, we've put in decades of work sort of figuring out what we mean by bringing police and communities to a point of trust building and a reconciliation process. What is it that you would say are elements of that process?
What they all said. There are a lot of police executives, police departments that would have nothing to do with the enterprise that we're talking about, right? And I am not talking about working with them. But we find that there are a probably quite surprising number of such leaders and executives and agencies that are actually quite committed to doing this kind of work. And they begin with a commitment to reform. There are lots of very progressive agencies and chiefs out there. They want to do better. They kind of broadly agree that we've been over-policing and under-protecting. We've locked too many people up. There are lots organized against mass incarceration. They're doing all sorts of things that we can kind of bloodlessly lump together under policy and practice reform. But to the point that was just made, that's not reparation. Right? Changing things because one is in a position of power and privilege and has changed one's mind and is making a unilateral decision to do something differently does not respect what we're talking about. It does not respect the historic experience of damaged peoples. It does not honor the unspeakable harm that all represents. It does not recognize not only the experience of harmed communities, but what that means for the way they look at people on the job today. So we have a good colleague on all of this, Pastor Ben McBride in the Bay Area in California, who teaches much of what we've been talking about to folks coming on the job in the Oakland Police Department. And he says to new recruits, when you wear the uniform in my neighborhood, my community does not see you. He says to them, history has stolen your identity. And I think it's simply a fact that there is no way of legitimately engaging with the business of reform without being honest about what happened and what it has meant. And as we've been schooled by people who have done this work in other settings, so there's very little experience with what we're talking about in this country, which is police community reconciliation. We use those words as placeholders, but that endeavor, there's a lot of work with reconciliation internationally in other settings. And Veronica, to your question, as we've learned from that experience in that community, there are these fundamental building blocks of what this work means if one is to do it seriously. There has to be an honest acknowledgement of what was real and what it meant. So at least an acknowledgement of the historic and present harm that has been done in that world. And as one tries to do this in real places with real people, people can get all kind of tangled up with apologies. And the folks who've done this work will say, apologies are personal, apologies are heartfelt, apologies can't be scripted, they happen or they don't. Acknowledgement is structural, acknowledgement is historic, acknowledgement is factual. There has to be an opportunity for those who have been harmed to speak to their experience and to be heard. And again, folks of power and privilege and standing tend to go into those kinds of engagements, and they know what they think, and they know what they think about what they've heard, and they go very quickly to, here's my reaction and here's my plan, and we're not very good at shutting up and listening to what people have to say. So that kind of very deliberate, active attention to the experiences of harmed communities. The stories really matter. People shape and communicate their experience by the stories that they tell. And we heard from the folks who put together the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa that this was back when it was, and these were TV spots and radio spots and that kind of thing. But as they took testimony and did their historiography and populated the docket about people's experiences under apartheid, particular of those narratives were put on the airwaves. And it was a very deliberate campaign, and the folks who did this said, we knew that there was no way we were going to get 20% of the white folks. They were a lost cause. We knew 20% were with us already. We didn't need to worry about them. We were after the 60% in the middle. And so to be able to do what we call narrative capture and dissemination, to identify those particularly meaningful experiences, to get them out these days, not just on radio and TV, but in all kinds of different ways. And there should be a consensus account of the fact of what happened, so that it is no longer possible for people to say in various ways, that was a long time ago, why don't they get over it, it doesn't matter, why are people looking at me? There should be an unmistakable irreproachable consensus record that says these things happened, we will no longer pretend they didn't, we will no longer pretend it doesn't matter. And as with all of these things, there are any number of ways to do this. We'll be talking with some folks from Stockton, California later. And when we were talking about this with them the first time, some of the community folks there said, you're not talking about a written document, are you? If you want to make sure that nobody pays attention to something, write it down. We want a museum, we want art. And I'm who I am, and I think about written documents. They thought about something else, which made perfect sense. And then there is a very important and open question. What is it that we're talking about? Can we reconcile? Does that word even make sense? And I'll say it again, we use it as a placeholder because very possibly it doesn't make sense. But what we've had in mind at the National Network is our experience of working deeply with both communities that want things to be very different, and as the National Initiative ground research shows very clearly, in these most troubled spots in 6 American cities, people didn't trust the police, but they wanted a better relationship with the police. They wanted public safety. They have a deep and abiding respect for the law. And they don't trust the police, and they've got very good reason for not trusting the police. And we work in these same places, not everywhere, but in these places, with police agencies that desperately want to do better, and are coming to understand some of the historic and structural reasons that they can't do as well as they'd like to. And so we have a limited but important goal, which is that in places where there is an awful lot of common aspiration and there is not the trust and relationship to get there, to create the ground for there being sufficient trust and sufficient relationship to figure out then how to do better. And so the last really important link between the truth-telling and the acknowledgement and the relationship building is to build links to change, to figure out from a different and somewhat more respectful and understanding place how it is we can collectively better do the long-term work of doing better. And I'll just say one more thing here and stop, which is that, you know, we're in New York City, where not that long ago NYPD was making nearly 700,000 pedestrian stops a year, and because of political action, that's no longer true. If one believes NYPD numbers, those stops are down over 98%. That's a policy and a practice change. That is not reparation yet, right? It's not reparation until we are consciously saying we are making this change because we recognize the harm that has been done, and we are affirmatively honoring and responding to that harm. And so work that can be done out of a respect for that harm and informed by it, we think is a fundamentally different enterprise.
Thank you. And I myself am very excited to be on this journey and to start to partner with police departments around the country doing this work. If we could just have final thoughts from our panelists, something that you would like the audience to take away from them as they leave today and digest all of this that you've shared.
I was thinking about your question to David about the elements of what his work means and all of our work. I think the only thing I would add to that is the idea as it relates to working with local and statewide law enforcement that our work can't be just a box that we continue to check for a diversity training. Our work cannot just be a political hot button during a mayoral race candidacy. It has to be this idea of, as if I could quote King and Gandhi, and this idea of a beloved community, and this idea that we have to love each other beyond ourselves. I think that our work must reflect community and law enforcement. So we've trained over 1,100 local and statewide agents and commissioned officers and seasoned officers and cadets, but we've also trained over 6,000 people in the community who are saying that we too are coming to the table apart from the police, wanting to do this introspective work, wanting to reconcile with who we are. So I think if I would just add to that element, it has that responsibility and burden falls on the community as well.
One thing that I would just want to lay on the table, because I think in a couple places in the conversation we've said history singular and community singular, and one of the things that really struck me in talking about this work in the National Initiative cities is the plurality of both of those things. So just to name one of the National Initiative communities in Minneapolis, there's the history with the long-standing Great Migration African-American population there, with the East African population that's come relatively recently, with the Native American population, with the Hmong population, with the LGBT community. And as the National Initiative cities were getting into this work, particularly the ones that pushed the furthest, they had to develop this understanding of this particular histories and dynamics and the reconciliation work that had certainly overlap and common themes, but in fact, seeing that they had to be ready to meet the diversity of the community and the diversity of the painful histories there and understand all of those narratives and make sure they were conversant and ready to engage in that way.
I think that, as was mentioned previously, this is a really big idea and is deeply important work. And so I always want to make sure that anytime I'm speaking publicly that everyone understands that I'm deeply supportive of the work that's being done. And so I'll start there. And then I'll just add that the problem that the network is confronting has so many layers and there's so much connective tissue between sort of injustice of all types, right? And so if we're talking about relationships between the police and communities of color, right? That's naturally and sort of inextricably linked to a conversation about segregation, about what that means, about how it came to be. Because where I'm from, on the south side of Chicago, part of the reasons that these problems exist is because all the black folks live in one place. And so from a policy standpoint, it becomes much easier to inflict harm on an entire community when that entire community can be pinpointed and can be targeted in ways that are related to policy of other types. I don't know how we have a conversation about police impact and about police relationships with communities without also talking about the wealth gap, right? And to be clear, most of my professional background comes in the setting of education. And so in the same way that communities of color have deep distrusts of police officers, we also have deep distrust of schools, of teachers, of administrators, of hospitals, of nurses, of doctors, right? And so I think that this is deeply important work, and I think that one of the reasons it's deeply important work is because the way that we think about police and policing is central to the myth-making that exists around what it means to be an American. And so if we can get to the heart of the problem on this issue, then I will be far more hopeful about our ability to get to the heart of the matter on all of the issues that are tied up with this issue. And so I am, to the extent that I can, always kind of rooting for David and his team because I want to see them do great work in this space, but also more broadly because doing great work in this space means that perhaps it's possible for us to do great work in all spaces.
Thank you. If you could all please join me in thanking our panelists. And for those of you who are able to stay, we will have refreshments afterward. And for the panelists who are able to stick around for a little bit, you can speak with them and ask further questions. Thank you. Please stay tuned for the second panel.
Hi, folks. Sorry. So the program isn't open.
Take your seats. We're going to begin the next panel. Thank you. So I want to introduce to you all today Karen Brannan. Karen is a veteran journalist whose work has appeared in Life, The Guardian, Miss, Mother Jones, Christian Science Monitor, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Minneapolis Star-Tribune, Women's Day, Scholastic Teacher, Ladies' Home Journal, and the New York Times. Her work as a documentary filmmaker and researcher has been broadcast on PBS, CBS, CBC, CNN, and BBC. The Family Tree, Karen's book, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 2016. She currently works with the Coming to the Table and local community remembrance projects to investigate, educate about, and memorialize lynchings, as well as to create restorative justice projects. I first met Karen last October in New Orleans. Karen was among many participants in an event that acknowledged the lives lost to racial violence at the hands of the police. Descendants of the victims shared painful stories that, as an African-American woman, I could and did relate to. And Karen began to share her story, and I went through a range of emotions, from anger to grief to sadness and finally to hope. And I have come to understand that while This is a very complex issue, and it has many, many stories to tell. There are some stories that we just haven't heard enough of, some voices that need to be elevated because there are people out there who will relate to them in a way that the other voices have not been able to touch them to move this work forward. And for that reason, I knew it was very important to bring Karen here today. And so if you can help me to please welcome Ms. Karen Brannan to share her story with you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I assume there are people out there. I'm going to pretend there's only one. I didn't set out to write a book. I set out to discover why I was having nightmares. Why I was having nightmares of guns and black people and babies being threatened and disappearing. And this was a time in my life, I had just turned 50, and I had been told that I was to be the grandmother of a racially mixed child. And I was living in Minneapolis, and I had worked on racial justice issues most of my adult life. And yet the impending arrival of this dear baby had me terrified, because I still had family in Georgia, an older generation that was very racist. And I was not sure how they would accept this child in our lily white family, or so I thought, that I had a lily white family. More was to come on that. And things began to happen to me. Little breadcrumbs got placed in my path, saying to me, go home, find out what happened. And I was an investigative reporter. I had reported on wars and death squads and famines and gangs and all manner of difficult, terrifying issues with not much trepidation. And yet the idea of going home, which was to Georgia, specifically to Columbus, Georgia, and to neighboring Harris County, Georgia, which is where my ancestors all lived, terrified me. Terrified me. And to this day, I am still surprised at how frightened I was to do this. When it later came to the point that I thought I needed to write a book, I was even more terrified, because good white Southern girls did not air their family laundry. And I had discovered there was a lot of family laundry, a lot of dirty laundry to be aired. One of the things that I learned a lot about my family's history, and it took me a very long time to explore, largely because I did not know very much about Southern history. I knew that Southern history that I had been taught at Columbus High School and at the University of Georgia. It wasn't true history. It was called lost cause history. It was the history of what white leaders wish had happened, or it was their idea of why things had happened, but it wasn't true history. And so when I began to examine documents and to interview people, I realized that there was a lot I didn't understand. I was like a babe in the woods. I was ignorant, I was illiterate. And so I had to go back into the books, back into new studies. And fortunately, this time, a whole new generation of Southern historians and American historians had gotten more honest about our history. It's not all there quite yet, but there's a lot more there. But my best information came talking to people on their front porches, in their cornfields. And the witnesses, and they were truly witnesses, wonderful witnesses. They were mostly all in their 90s, some in their 80s. They were black and they were white. They had been there forever in Harris County, Georgia, in Hamilton, Georgia. Some had never even been as far as Atlanta. Some spoke in such a country brogue, I almost needed a translator to understand them. Fortunately, I taped them, so I was able to come home and play over and over and over, so I made sure I got it right. I had been made afraid, actually, by some of my journalist friends in D.C., where I live, who said to me, "You've got to be careful when you go down there. You know, sit with your back to the wall. Watch yourself. You know, you never know what those folks are going to do." I did not expect cooperation. I honestly did not even expect memory, because this lynching that I was looking into, as it turned out, took place in 1912. So if people were alive at the time, they were children. So I did not expect, I expected them to say what my mother had said. That never happened. My grandmother was the first person to tell me about the lynching, though she called it a hanging. I did an oral history with her before she died. And at the end, I said, "What is your most unforgettable memory?" And without missing a beat, she said, "The hanging." And she described some men and a woman hanged downtown in the out of doors. But she did not say they were black, and white people, when describing anything that has black people in it in the South, will make sure you know that. So I figured it was an all-white judicial. She said they'd been found guilty. I thought it was judicial. So I didn't really press her on that, and I didn't look into it. But it was only 2 years after that I learned of my great-granddaughter on the way. And I began to have these nightmares and these fears for her well-being, for her mother's well-being, for my son's well-being, all out of proportion to any reality. There was something deep in my cells that was making me afraid. And so when that old African-American woman came to my room one night as a ghost and said to me, "Go home, find out what happened," I took it as an order. I took it as an assignment that I dare not turn down. And I knew that wherever it took me and however long it took me and whatever I learned, I would do it. And y'all, that's just not me. That is just not me. I had spent my life turning down some assignments, and anything that said no pay, long hours, you might get killed, anything could happen. But I knew I had to do this. And I somehow felt it was what I had been put on this earth to do. And I don't even think like that. But I found myself for years and years and years driving my beat-up old Toyota down to Harris County, Georgia, to interview people, to go through the courthouse files and records. I was lucky for a while in the courthouse because the clerk of court, Miss Becky, had known my sheriff grandfather and thought highly of him. And I told her I was, looking into some of his work. I wanted to get to know him better and see what sort of cases he had handled and how he'd handled them. And she kind of rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, Lord," and gave me the run of the courthouse. And that was very useful to me. Later on, after Miss Becky retired, the younger generation wasn't all that eager to have me poking around. And so they put a stop to it. But by then, I had gotten pretty much everything I needed. I grew up in the 40s and the 50s, and I did not observe the kind of crass violence that I discovered went on before my time by my family. But it was a more genteel form of violence in which Edna, our maid, had to go to the bathroom in the garage bathroom, had to sit in the back seat when there was only one person in the front seat, had to come in the back door while we went in the front door, had to eat standing up in the kitchen while we ate at the table. I remember my first lesson in racial etiquette, as it was called. I was spanked in public in the department store because I drank out of the colored water fountain. Now, what 5-year-old child faced with 2 water fountains, one that says white and one that says colored, wouldn't choose the colored water? So I chose the colored water and was beat for it. Later on, I was taught, this is about water too, there was a lot of racial stuff around water. I was taught that when I handed the man who took care of our yard, a glass of water, I should not let him take the glass. I should put the glass on the step so that our hands didn't accidentally touch. So these little things, which I had completely forgotten, quite frankly, when I started this, started to come back. And one of the things, as I was learning a lot of these hard facts about the 2 Americas that existed side by side as I was growing up, and to this day, too much so, I discovered that I had been so deeply imprinted with racist behavior and racist thinking that all my efforts to undo that and to be different, to act different, to live in a different world. I left the South as soon as I could, about 10 days after I graduated from the University of Georgia, and thought I was free of all that. That so much of it was still there. So many things I just assumed because I had grown up in a world that said, you are better because you are white and for no other reason than people who are not white. And as hard as I worked against that, I still had it in me. And that was part of the fear of going back into all of this. But I did anyway. And eventually I learned that on January 22nd, 1912, around midnight, members of my family had viciously murdered, lynched 4 African Americans beside a baptismal font, an outdoor baptismal font at the Friendship Baptist Church, which was about 2 blocks from the square in Hamilton, Georgia. Everything's still there, just like it was then. The woman's name was Loduska Dusky Crutchfield. The men were John Moore, Gene Harrington, and Burl Hardaway. Reverend Hardaway was a minister of the St. James AME Church. John Moore, who was only 21 years old, was, I later discovered, a member of my family. He was the nephew of my 3rd great uncle, who had one slave, and by the slave named Jane Moore, he had 7 children, who he claimed as his own, which was fairly unusual back then, and left land to them when he died. So the sheriff was my great-grandfather. His son, my grandfather, was the deputy. John Moore was known by them to be blood kin. Dusky Crutchfield was not, they were suspected, the 3 men were suspected of conspiring to murder the sheriff's white nephew, a man named Norman Hadley. The woman was supposed to be the star witness at the trial. She had taken a very brave, a heroic stance against naming these 3 men, or any of these 3 men, all of whom turned out to be innocent. A trial would have caused a scandal, because it would have been about white male predators and black women. Norman Hadley had been trying to get for his own concubine the 14-year-old daughter of one of the men who was lynched. John Moore, the youngest man who was lynched, was her boyfriend. The preacher was her preacher. The preacher had been speaking in the pulpit against Norman Hadley, the sheriff's nephew. It would have been a scandal. Northern papers were already beginning to write stories about Southern hypocrisy in regard to sex, about how white men often had 2 families, a white family here, a black family there. And I discovered through my mother, who told me absolutely nothing other than the fact that my grandmother had lied when she had said there was a hanging, told me about the 2 families. And there was a campaign going on in the country, something I've never read in any history books at all. Very little has been written about it, but there was a campaign going on, not in the country, but in the South, against miscegenation, against any black people having sex or living with or marrying any white people. So this had been going on in Hamilton. There was quite a lot of Sturm und Drang about interracial sex, about miscegenation. And I believe that this lynching was a lynching carried out to send a message, loud and clear, to both blacks and whites. I think there were a lot of different messages going on within this lynching, but it was to draw a line in the sand about black and white families. So when you read a list of all the reasons why lynchings took place, you don't see this. If anybody's seen it, I'd like to know, because I've read lists and lists and lists, and I've never seen anything about white male predators. And it's not just about white male predators. It's two things, and it's hard to talk about this, but you know, there were families. There were actual racially mixed families where if there was coercion, it was just the coercion that existed because of the imbalance in power. But there was more family feeling. And this was what I found in the Moore family. But then I also found, on my father's side of the family, a lot of out-and-out rape by white men of black women. So when the first witness I talked to down in Harris County, an old black woman named Verna Green, just out of the blue says to me, well, you know, there were all these old white bachelors that used to come hang out at our cabins all the time. I wasn't sure what she was talking about. I thought she just wanted to, you know, I don't know, I just wasn't sure. And nobody in the beginning was willing to come right out and say to me, this lynching was about sex. This lynching was about family. So I had to put some pieces together in different places. And the people who really did not want to talk about this were white people. Some did, though. Some did. And they gave me pretty much the final stuff that I needed. So here I was, about to have a racially mixed grandchild, and I hid her from her Georgia family because of these fears I had of what they would do or what they would say. And, you know, if I had not done this research, I would have probably just kept it that way. Pretty much what they did back then. Just hide them. I mean, I was doing a little bit better, but just hide them. And then what they did, if they really make trouble, just kill them. That's what they did. So I had to face that I came out of a generation after generation after generation, as most white Southerners do if they really want to look into it, of our flesh and blood, because it's a little too dark, being sold down the river, being sold off so a white child can go to college, being hung from trees because they've become inconvenient, or because we want to protect the white cousin that really killed Norman Hadley, and that's what happened. So black men died for numerous reasons, having nothing to do with anything they did. Died for that white man to go free. Died for that family not to be scandalized. Died for that new sheriff not to look bad because he'd arrested the wrong people, and it was his own white nephew that had killed the other nephew. This is right out of the Bible stuff. I mean, this is so primitive. And yet, my grandfather, who helped to raise me, was there when it happened, so it wasn't that long ago. connection, slavery, I went back to slavery. And I read things that illuminated for me the close connection between plantations and law enforcement. In Hamilton, Georgia, in Harris County, Georgia, the sheriff who, during slavery I had 6 sheriffs, a direct line, 6 sheriffs on both sides of my mother's line and my father's line. So almost any period I looked at, the sheriff was my flesh and blood. He was paid to whip slaves. He sold slaves at the courthouse door when there was a slave sale. It was the sheriff doing the selling. I saw one little 7-year-old girl sold all by herself. So early on, law enforcement saw itself primarily as maintaining slave control. And so after slavery, what did they do in the South? The slave owners looked around and said, well, we got to find a way to keep them working for nothing. Otherwise, they may start getting highfalutin ideas like going to college and becoming lawyers and teachers. So they created the convict slave, the convict labor market. They passed laws making it okay to institutionalize, to penalize, and then to put them back on the plantations. The best book written about that, you probably know about, is Worse Than Slavery. There are several others too. After the war ended, most of my relatives went into, in slavery, during slavery, I found a pamphlet at the University of North Carolina. They have a lot of my family's papers. The family started in Raleigh, North Carolina, and so the Raleigh branch of the family was really very wealthy and very large slave owners, and they kept their papers, and they're all at the University of North Carolina now, so I got to go through those papers, and in them I found a pamphlet called Negro Handling, and it was basically a how to deal with your slaves. And so, during all those years of farming, and one side of my family owned close to 100 slaves, my father's side. My mother's side, 2 or 3, 4. But both of them went into law enforcement of some level after, during the war they were too, but after, this became the family business. This is how you made money off of black people, to continue on ad infinitum. So they became everything from bailiffs and deputy sheriffs and the convict overseers, the road overseers, to judges and senators. And 2 of my grandfathers were on the prisons committee in the state legislature, which wrote the laws that furthered the slavery system. So, this is in the DNA of law enforcement even today. This is what your work is, Negro handling. And it's not as obvious anymore. It's not as clear, it's not, but we all know that's still a mandate, or feels to be. And it's people like middle-class white people I mean, I live in a neighborhood that is being quickly gentrified. I mean, it's not being quickly gentrified. A neighborhood nearby is being quickly gentrified, but it's a neighborhood where white people like to call the cops on black people a lot. And they do at every pretext that they possibly can. And it's very hard to talk to other white people about what this says, about what the ripple effects of this kind of behavior are. They don't want to, because immediately, I'm not a racist. Nobody uses the word racist. I didn't use the word racist. I just said, let's think about how the impact that this has. No, we don't want to do that. So at every turn, and I'm sure there are those of you out here who are facing that too, how do we talk to white people? How do we say why this is not in our interest to behave like this, to see the police as our private protection force, to give them the idea that we are the ones to be protected, not to reach out, not to call out when police brutality is occurring against African American people. I see some changes in this, some changes in white people's thinking, but not enough. We've got a long way to go. So some of the things that I discovered when I was looking at that particular 1912 lynching was that it was the last open-air lynching. It was the last public spectacle lynching. It didn't exactly fit the description of a spectacle lynching because it happened at midnight. So, there weren't huge crowds. There was no picnic. There was no burning. It was described as militarily precise. There were a lot of official law enforcement people there. Nobody ever got named. Parties unknown. The 4 came to their deaths at the hands of parties unknown. And most of those parties, in most of those lynchings, the 4,000 plus lynchings all across America, are still parties unknown. And there are many, many white people just like me who are beginning to look at their own family histories. But it's not an easy thing to come forth with this. And my message to them is, you'll be doing yourself a huge favor if you do it. And you'll be doing our country a huge favor if you do it. Because none of the horrible things that I dreaded and had nightmares about has come to be. A few people, I've gotten a few nasty letters. They're kind of funny, actually. A few people won't speak to me anymore, but they hardly ever did anyway. But the gifts have just been incredible. Incredible. I was, one of the first places I went to speak was LaGrange, Georgia. LaGrange is in Troup County, which is right next to Harris County. And there's a college there, a Methodist college. And I had gone to hear Brian Stevenson speak in Washington, D.C. And I sat next to a guy who was a librarian at a small Christian college in Pennsylvania. And I was telling him about my book, which had just come out. And he said, well, you need to call my friend Dan McAlexander, who's the president of LaGrange College. So I called Dan McAlexander, and he said, oh, great. He said, come on down. We're having we have a racial trust building group going on in LaGrange. And we are having a breakfast on, 2 weeks from now, and you could talk about your book. And I thought, wow, this is too good to be true. LaGrange, Georgia, is like right next to Hamilton, and, they had already, well, that's a whole nother story. So I go down, and I find about 100 people, and they are everything from the mayor down to people on the street, who've been meeting together once a month to learn how to talk to each other across race lines. And they're a little bit nervous about me being there because they haven't talked about lynching, and they're afraid that's going to be like too volatile. But we have a great conversation. And after it's over, this guy comes across and shakes my hand and introduces himself as the police chief. Lou Deckmar is his name. And he said, have you ever heard of Austin Calloway? And I said, yes, he was a 16-year-old who was lynched right here, in LaGrange in 1941, 40 or 41. He says, well, as you were talking, I decided that I'm going to make a public apology for the lynching of Austin Calloway. And I said, well, if you do, you're going to be the first police chief in the country that I know of that has ever done this. And he said, well, I'm going to do it. And not only did he do it, but he came together. It was just one of these things that happens where nothing is ever just one person or one group's idea. So another group had been working on Austin Calloway's lynching, and another group, and they all began to come together, and they had this incredible memorial service, two memorial services. One, EJI came and planted a marker, and the other, almost every white minister in town made his own separate apology to the family members, not just Austin Calloway, but several other families of people who had been lynched in that county. Then in my own book, I had mentioned, I didn't call it a lynching because it wasn't officially a lynching. It was a police murder in the jail, in the Hamilton jail, when my grandfather, who was the young deputy in 1912, he became sheriff of Harris County, Georgia for 26 years. So in 1946, when he was sheriff and responsible for prisoner safety, the police chief, who was his close friend, and some of his lieutenants beat a black farmer to death in the jail, who was a totally innocent man. He was believed to have been harboring a fugitive. There are questions as to whether they just wanted to get rid of him. He was a very successful black farmer in Troup County, but he had been brought into Harris County for some reason. So the same day that I was in LaGrange talking to the Racial Trust Building group, that afternoon I went to the library to just do like general public. And I began to tell the story of Henry Gilbert, who is the man who was murdered in the jail. And I wasn't sure why I was telling that story because I usually focused on the 1912 lynching. So as I began to talk about Henry Gilbert, a small group of elderly African American, two women in wheelchairs, began to poke one another. And I stopped and I said, "Are you Mr. Gilbert's family?" And they said yes. And they had, this story had been kept a secret in their family. None of my generation had been told. They were all my mother's generation, a little bit younger. And there's a group in Boston at Northeastern University Law School, which some of you may know about, called the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project. And they investigate cold cases, civil rights era cold cases. And Henry Peg Gilbert, was one of their cases. And so just shortly before that, the students had been interviewing the Gilbert family. So all of this was coming out. But I didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't know what I was doing. And it would have been wonderful if we could have done it together, because I think we might have developed a lot more detailed information. But that's something, that we're working on now, trying to do more of, bring white people like me who are able to get information from within their white families, that if students or people from out of the blue came in and started asking, I don't think they would talk. So, in some ways, it's kind of a monstrous way to be with your family. But I think that, the greater good requires it. And I think also what my situation is showing is that there's really not that much to lose. There's more to gain. There may be some shame, there may be some embarrassment. But what it does is it builds bridges, and it makes better communities. And in the long haul, I think whatever embarrassment there is, whatever shame, whatever ostracism might occur, is going to pay off in a healthier democracy. Another thing I learned two things. I learned that women, black and white women, were very important in the fight against lynching in this country and in Harris County. And I write about that in my book. And in Harris County, it came, for the white women, it came through of all places, the Women's Missionary Society of the Methodist Church, which took a stand in 1913 against lynching. And one of my cousins, a woman named Miss Lula Mobley, played a very big part in that. And what had happened after the 1912 lynching, one of the things that people told me, black and white people told me, they said nobody was found guilty, but every man in that mob died with his boots on. Well, I don't know about every man, because there was supposedly 100 in the mob, but I was able to find 15 who were named as major mob leaders who were murdered by other men in the mob. There was a killing spree that went on among white men who had taken place in that mob, who had taken a part in that mob. Now, they were all moonshine people, so it could have been more moonshine related, but it could have been that something about their participation in murdering these 4 people, including a woman, including a preacher, that that knocked things out of kilter, that caused some kind of meltdown among all of them. We'll probably never know that, but 15 of them were murdered within the next 10 years by someone else that had been in that mob. And they also, some who died, had killed somebody else. And so Miss Lula, whether it was for black people or for white people or for just people in general who were being murdered in Harris County, Georgia, called all the white ladies of her church together. And they called all the men together, and they said to them, enough killing. Now, I didn't learn this from white people. I learned this from African Americans who felt that this was when women, this was in the 20s, in the early 20s, and women had gotten the vote, and they were getting their voice. And a larger group that grew out of and were inspired by NAACP and African American women's organizations were having an impact. And even though the white women would not, they formed an organization called the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching. They would not integrate with, they were still racist, they would not integrate with black women who had been struggling against lynching through Ida Wells Barnett had been struggling against lynching, but they took up the cause. And so in Harris County, the last time an open-air lynching was attempted, white women stepped into the breach and said, no, you're not going to do it, and they didn't. So, you know, this is something that I would love to see white women begin to do more of. And they are doing more of it than they have been doing. To step in and say, this is our cause too. This is affecting our communities too. We are all one. We're all family. Now, soon after my book came out, I looked for descendants of the 4 who were lynched in 1912, and I had no luck. But soon after my book came out, I got an email from a woman who said, I have such mixed emotions, I hardly know where to begin, but I am a descendant of John Moore, the youngest man lynched in 1912, which means I am related to you. And thus began my relationship with 3 wonderful sisters who are my cousins, who grew up at about the same time I did, in the same place, who have followed much the same path I did, educationally, interests. They're all professors. They're all in education. One of them is a wonderful professor at AU, has written a book recently called Policing the Black Man with Brian Stevenson, and does incredible criminal justice work. And these are people that I would never have been able to have anything to do with growing up in Columbus, Georgia. And I have far more in common with them, and we're far more connected than I am with any of my white cousins. But also, I have had white cousins come forward who said, I left that town long ago just like you did for the same reasons. And these are people I've never known. And so, you know, instead of losing family, I've gained family. And a family that are all trying to do things pretty much like I'm trying to do, though none have aired the family laundry. Thank you very much.
Please help me thank Karen Brannan. Thank you, Karen. And we'll have our final panel with the Stockton Police Department and community members joining us here momentarily. Thank you. Welcome. And we're just going to remove the chair, and then we'll have our moderator come out. So please welcome Luisa Avila. She's our Group Violence Intervention Director, and she will be welcoming our panel here from Stockton, California. Thank you, Luisa.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am not David Kennedy, obviously, but his absence is my privilege. I am really thrilled to be moderating this panel, and thank you to our colleagues in Stockton for not letting a mere few thousand miles stand in the way of your participation today. We're really lucky to have you. Why don't we start off by having each of you introduce yourselves and share a little bit about your role in the ongoing effort in Stockton to bring about a police community reconciliation process. Why don't we begin with you, Chief?
Okay, great. Thank you for having us here from Stockton. I am the police chief here. Been with Stockton PD for a little over 25 years. And my role has really been to lead the department clearly and bring the trust building efforts through something we call principled policing. So we have two pillars of policing, which is smarter policing, that's being effective and efficient, but principled policing, which is why we do what we do and who we stand for. And so under that umbrella, really my role has been to infuse into the culture of the police department the trust building work that we hold near and dear to our heart. And specifically, I led the listening sessions and the beginning reconciliation sessions. I felt it was important, as you heard earlier in the panel, as the executive leader for my police department, for me to make those acknowledgments that you heard about earlier today about what the burden that this badge does carry, being upfront about that and leading listening sessions. And we are currently working on moving those listening sessions out through other parts of our department and all through the community.
Hi, my name is Tony McNeil. I am a clergy, an elder at Victory and Praise Church, and I'm a community organizer with Faith in the Valley. I have been doing this work with the procedural justice since 2017. I was introduced to it through Tashante, actually. She introduced me to Captain Metters, and Captain Metters then in turn allowed me to sit through a train the trainer session, which was my first touch with principal policing and the PJ work. I was so overwhelmed and so moved and taken by just the interactions and the work that was done that I went back to my executive director with Faith in the Valley and let her know that we absolutely needed to be involved in a deeper level in order making sure this was getting rolled out into the community. Faith in the Valley has 5 counties that we work with throughout the Central Valley. So we have San Joaquin County, Kern County, Stanislaus County, Fresno County, and Merced. And so we've brought in organizers from all of those counties in to go through the PJ3 training that is co-facilitated with myself and one of the officers here. And we also assist in implementing or infusing, I should say, some of our clergy, congregation, and community members into the community trust building, which is the history of policing workshops that take place here in Stockton. So I'm happy to be here.
I am Tashante McCoy-Ham. I wear many hats. I'm the founder of the OWL movement here in Stockton, California, and I am the chapter and membership development manager for Alliance for Safety and Justice. It is actually my work that I've been able to do under the Alliance for Safety and Justice through Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice Survivor Speaks conference is how I was connected to the work. That is where Chief Jones and I made our first acquaintance. And through that experience began an ongoing conversation about the need to bring voices of the community into spaces such as these, and just the importance of building community trust. So I've been able to participate in a couple of the first procedural justice trainings, which included community members as well as implicit bias, have been able to organize several courageous conversations between law enforcement and community members. Participated a little bit in the beginning of the policy advisory board, and just being connected and readily available to make the connection between our law enforcement and our community members here in Stockton in a way that is positive and solution-based.
I'm Scott Metters. I'm a captain with Stockton Police Department. My role, I've been one of the lead facilitators around procedural justice. And as we've moved into implicit bias and reconciliation, I lead the trust building workshops with other facilitators And my role is to help continue to build a space where we can bring community members and police officers together to have conversations around mistrust, a history. And within that trust building workshop, we do present a history and we talk about reconciliation and that acknowledgement of the past and how it continues to affect us today.
Thank you all. I'm remembering here for folks who may not have the full picture or coming in partway through, you guys are throwing out a lot of national initiative jargon. So Stockton is one of the 6 cities that the National Network, our partners at the Urban Institute and other organizations worked with as part of the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. So in addition to your police community reconciliation work, you've invested heavily in procedural justice training and training around implicit bias, which is what we call PJ3 in National Initiative lingo. So with that context, Chief, can I ask you to say a little bit about what the reconciliation part of that endeavor in particular meant to you and why you thought that work was particularly important in Stockton among all of the laudable work that the National Initiative attempted and that you all are doing?
Yeah, so we were and have been working on the importance of community relations for years. And one of the advantages of working with the National Initiative is we as a department knew we wanted to build relationships in new and better ways. But we were given a framework with this reconciliation work. And actually what I believe is a formula that finally helps break open some real dialogue to take race relations head on. I mean, we need to have these discussions. And speaking for myself, we'd had town halls. We will continue to have town halls. They're very important, large neighborhood meetings. But I think we all know real solutions don't typically come out of those, nor are really everyone's voices truly heard in a meaningful way. So really what I found is by essentially, as David pointed out earlier on today, is by at least acknowledging the undeniable facts of a lot of the history, because we certainly know in our African American communities, as an example, those narratives, those histories are there and they're real. And even though much of this happened a long time ago, in the scope of things, it really wasn't that long ago. But we in law enforcement have to at least acknowledge those facts, because then I found it breaks open actual, real, true dialogue. And we're able to now develop this new space where we can have these conversations and again talk about race relations head on. And it's not necessarily that if we look at that past historical piece that my officers in a lot of the stories heard, for example, today, certainly the Stockton police officers were not involved. But recognizing that the police badge, whatever shape it is, whether it be a sheriff's star, an oval badge, a shield badge, like we have, that law enforcement badge still holds that history that, again, needs to at least be acknowledged. And then through these reconciliation sessions and listening sessions, we do active listening and police work. And I will tell you, I was accustomed to early on going to a community meeting and hearing from community members, but as they're speaking, I'm starting to formulate what my response is, because I want to respond, right? I want to come back with maybe an immediate explanation as to why something happened or didn't happen, and training myself to actually do active listening, really hear. And we've really, through this space we've been talking about, we've really learned the connection between gun violence intervention or reducing violent crime and trust. And when we talk about the communities most impacted, most affected, speaking for Stockton, I believe the other pilot sites are the same as most cities across the nation are. Those communities, and they're typically communities of color, that have the highest crime also have the highest levels of mistrust. We may know that intuitively, but we now have data to support that. And we know that's where we need to really invest the most time to not only build trust, but to also reduce violent crime. And both of those are what we should be doing as law enforcement officers.
Thank you, Chief. Can I ask a related question, and I'll frame it a little differently? Tashante, can you speak a little bit? I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit to the particular experience of communities in Stockton. So Chief Jones just mentioned that many of the communities that experience the most violence also have very high levels of distrust in law enforcement. Jesse Janetta, who was on our morning panel, spoke about the Urban Institute's findings across the 6 pilot sites, and it's something like 70% of the folks surveyed in those in that work generally felt that people ought to follow the law, but only about 30% of them trusted police personally. And I think we've heard from other speakers today a feeling that trust building and healing is a deeply personal experience. So will you say a little bit about where you think that trust gap has come from in Stockton, and to the extent that that's changing since you all have undertaken this process? Can you say a little bit about what that feels like?
Sure. I think the biggest thing is when you go back to the tough on crime days and the way that those type of communities of color were over policed contributes to a lot of it off the rip. And then I would say that the lack of understanding of who, what the role is, who we are, what the struggle is, the lack of not really being connected to the people who you serve on the end of law enforcement. And then as far as community members, not really being connected to what their role is in the community. And so it just makes for a big disastrous type scenario of individuals just not feeling one another, which leads to distrust. And then lack of communication when things take place and law enforcement has to be called out, not having a clear understanding of why they're taking my parents to jail, or why am I being taken away, or it has a lot to do with communication and educating the community. And I feel like during that tough on crime era, it was the goal was to be tough on crime. So there was no communication, there was no understanding between law enforcement and the communities who they were being tough on. And so, and it went on for quite some time. And I believe that after, being exposed to the national initiative and being able to organize some of those conversations where Chief literally sat there and listened, it makes me think about a Steve Covey concept of seeking to understand versus being understood. And in those moments of those courageous conversations and listening sessions, that's what I saw. It was like something totally different from what the perception of policing and police experiences are supposed to look like. You had several people who were like, I tell you, I don't want to do that. I don't see the purpose of that. And those who were brave enough to put their best foot forward to be a part of the change, we literally were able to see the results of that type of conversing between community members and law enforcement. It literally allowed many to develop a relationship that was ongoing between community and law enforcement, and literally seeing one another as part of one community. I think we don't realize where we drop the ball a lot, and what we don't realize in these conversations is that we're all a part of one community. And so in doing those listening sessions, we've been able to experience a lot of that, a lot of seeing one another. And then just reciprocated experiences. When you think about, building trust between community members, you expect community members to come in with a vulnerable mindset, with their guards down. But we've been able to see in a lot of the different scenarios where law enforcement also too are coming in vulnerable and willing to hold these spaces and conversations, and just always keeping the narrative of healing going through, and knowing that as a community, we have to find a way to heal, or to reveal and heal, in order to establish these relationships that are actually worthy. So we're pretty blessed, I feel, in Stockton, from many different perspectives, to be able to collaborate and find ways where we can overlap some of these experiences within our community between law enforcement and common street folks.
So you set me up perfectly. I want to turn back for a moment to Chief Jones and to you, Captain Meters, and then come back to you, Tashante and Tony. Can you bring us into the weeds a little bit on the activities that have been part of Stockton's trust building initiative? So you're using language that we'd heard earlier in the day around listening sessions and acknowledging harm. I know there's structure here that's really intentional. Will you start off, Chief or Captain, taking us through the mechanics of how that looks, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit as well how that's felt for your officers going through that process, seeing you all as leaders in the department commit to that process.
Yep, I'll start and then I'll have Scott dive in as well. But when we talk about trust building activities, it's I'll tell you what it's not for us. It's not a program or a project, which is could be viewed as a checkbox approach. For example, a coffee with the police event, which we love. We do all the time because it helps our officers get in these informal settings and have discussions with community, but it's not something just like that. It's so much larger. There's so many pieces to it. Different levels of listening sessions, what we call listening in a new way. So a lot of different spaces designed both geographically or based on different groups or individuals where we're having that constant discussion. As well as we've reshaped CompStat, which we call ICAP, Intelligence, Communication, and Planning meeting, where half of the meeting is spent on what are we going to do enforcement-wise for this issue or this community. Okay, now let's talk about what are we going to do to build trust in that community, because the two go hand in hand. So many examples of specific things we've been doing, and I'll have actually Scott talk about some even more specifics on that.
So our work originally, when we began with procedural justice, we started training the department, both sworn and non-sworn. And as we got into the conversations within the room and we start talking about, one of the main principles, giving people a voice, we realized that there's a way to bring community members into that space and give community members a voice directly with the officers and our professional staff each and every day. We made a conscious decision to look for community members that were willing to be a part of that discussion. And these were not community members that just supported the police, but community members that had experiences, both positive and negative, that were willing to be a part of a discussion to look at how do we move forward and start building this trust. And what we found very quickly when we had community members in the space with officers is that shared story becomes very important for the officers and for the community members. And many times in those classes, it was the first time for officers really to hear an experience directly from a community member, even a very negative one, but in a manner that allowed them to walk out of that room and understand the experience that they went through. For community members, from feedback that we got, it was the first time that they actually saw the officer as a person within the uniform and not just the uniform. In fact, Tony McNeil has really framed it up probably in one of the best ways that we heard, is that this uniform brings a voice with it and a history with it that's not mine. It's our responsibility in law enforcement to bring our voice forward and set a better narrative than what we inherited. Within those procedural justice classes, we started expanding and bringing community members into both the implicit bias classes and talking about stereotypes, and then the co-facilitation. And that has led to the chief's work. His original listening sessions and reconciliation has led to the trust building workshops. And those workshops are designed to have predominantly community members and then police officers, one or two at the table from command staff on down, to have conversations around procedural justice, but also conversations around that history. And within the framework of the trust building workshop, we will present a history, and we go back to the Bloodhound Law, where police were called slave catchers, and we build out through lynchings and the impact of lynchings. And we heard Mr. Shaw talk about the impact on his family. And that becomes the power of a workshop like that, when you have someone sharing a story that is history to them, but it has had such an impact on their family. And it's important for us in this profession to understand how important one encounter and the impact of that encounter can be, especially when it's such an event like that. The evolution of our trust building workshops is we have created a space where in law enforcement, we bring community members in and we facilitate it, but we're building upon that to co-facilitate trust building workshops in spaces created by community members, giving them the opportunity to share that language and bring us in, and we co-facilitate around that and still present that history. And what we have found is that history becomes so important is because it sets up the why the mistrust exists.
Tony, you're close to the communities that have been most harmed by racialized policing, and I appreciated what you just said, Captain, about how important it is to bring those stories into spaces where officers can take them in. Tony, can you say a little bit about why you believe this sort of trust building work is important to community members, to the community members who are coming through the door and participating in processes like these, and in some ways making themselves profoundly vulnerable by sharing some of these experiences?
Yes, so as an organizer, as a community organizer, we're trained to do a lot of listening, heavy listening within the community. And so having done that in congregations, on the concrete, with individuals, um, just in different shared spaces, you begin to hear the same thing over and over again in the communities. Not only do they not trust the police, but then they're saying we demand accountability. We want them to be held accountable for the different things that they're doing. And so when you lean in and you begin to ask the question, what does accountability look like? That's when you kind of get breaks, because um, when there isn't trust, I don't really know how to articulate what accountability is necessarily going to look like. I can say, it should look like everyone is fired and rehired, and and all of the bad cops are gone, and bring in, more people of color or what have you. But like I had shared with Captain Metters in the training, this really didn't have necessarily much to do with the faces of the officers, but the uniforms and the badges that they wore, that was attached to the history. So going back to that narrative that we were hearing over and over again from the community, in order for them to have restored trust, or us, I should say, to have restored trust, one of the things that we began doing, especially for Faith in the Valley, was creating spaces, shared spaces, where there could be accountability that was brought forth to the table through transparency and conversation. Those difficult conversations, which we would not have been able to successfully have if we hadn't already started to work in the city of Stockton through the cultural shift within our policing here in the city of Stockton. So then when you come in and you start holding partnership tables for heat, we do heat work here with Faith in the Valley. And so we have partnership tables surrounding hiring and the equipment use and accountability and the training that is taking place. Well, now that you're bringing community into those spaces, it makes it easier then for them to be open to hear and receive and learn from. And that shared space creates accountability. Now, when you have a space where you come in and an officer that is over the equipment begins to share a PowerPoint and explain all the equipment that is being used, then the community can come back in turn and ask questions that they never felt that they had permission to or right to ask, because there was this breach in communication. There was a barrier and a breakdown. So everything seems to just kind of be like puzzle pieces syncing together. Um, we're trying to figure out how to build trust, but you can't build trust unless there's an agreement. Restoration doesn't come on a one-sided. The officers can attempt to restore, but unless the community actually buys into it and has a desire to actually have restored relationship as well, it's not going to work. And so on a ground level, from an organizer's perspective, we're trying to create that space then to where the community members are immersed in communication, they're immersed in shared spaces, and then there is this shared accountability. If we're going to do principled policing, then we're going to have the pillars where there's voice and neutrality. I know I'm going to forget one: respect and trustworthiness. If the community doesn't know that that's what the officers are held accountable for internally, then how are they going to hold accountable the officers when they're stopped? And how are they knowing what to look for? And if they don't know what to look for, then they are going to, by default, automatically expect and then react to something that may or may not be so. And I'll kind of pin it here. I after going through all of the training, I walked away realizing I'm a survivor of domestic violence, and I grew up in domestic violence for years. I realized that no matter how much I didn't want to be in an abusive relationship, if I didn't know how not to be in an abusive relationship, even if I got with somebody who was not an abuser, by default, by the time I finished with him, he would be, because subconsciously I was going to create an environment that I was accustomed to being in, not because it's something I wanted, but it was just my homeostasis. It was my norm. Of the relationship. Walking away from the training, I realized that if we did not help build this healing space in the community, that the community by default was going to push up against what was taking place in Stockton PD, the change that was taking place. And so they would come out attempting to operate in the pillars of principal policing, but the community by default would push up against that because they're automatically expecting you to be abusive. So we had to make sure they knew what was going on and the officers knew what was going on, and bringing it all together in the same space. Hope that made sense.
Only one person, but I think it made a lot of sense. So will you say, Chief Jones, will you say a little bit more, if you can, about the impact, a little bit more about the impact that engaging in this process is having throughout the department? So you've talked sort of philosophically about what this sort of mindset shift this represents, and how intentional that's been. Are you seeing that showing up day to day in your line officers, in your day-to-day operations within the department?
I am. And so we've been hearing a lot from the community about this work. This work matters. This work is putting us on the right path for some great progress in this area. But we're also hearing the same from our officers. And so I'm glad you asked, because I think that's important for everybody to hear. I'm so proud of the men and women of Stockton PD for embracing this work. It's difficult work sometimes. It's roll up your sleeves, arduous, difficult work that we all recognize needs to be done to make a difference. And we have the statistics, if you will, from very thankful for the Urban Institute for showing through data that why we need to build more trust, where we can build more trust, and some specific areas where we can. And we've seen some results now over the couple years where it's working. So that's great. But we're also hearing from our officers. We're hearing anecdotally the stories they're bringing back about how, for example, procedural justice training. One would say officers would be pretty skeptical, perhaps, of getting involved in that type of training. But we highlight things like police cynicism, which hasn't been broached much today, but real quickly, it's not a matter of when an officer becomes cynical. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, based on the work that we do. And so a cynical officer is going to be less effective and have be less apt to build community connections. So through the training, we also address that and arm the officers with tools to combat cynicism. what I'm getting at is officers actually is one of the highest rated courses we'd ever had through evaluations. And we heard things like, thank you for reminding us why it is we put this badge on and do this work. A lot of positive feedback from the officers on us being willing as a police department to go out and do this heavy lift, this heavy work. And Scott might be able to have a couple other stories as well to highlight this. But we're getting a lot of positive momentum going on, not just in the community, not just in the police department, just together, because they're with each other in the training and they're actually able to be in one another's shoes a little bit, see through one another's lenses, and hear from one another about, oh, wow, I didn't know that your job was that demanding, or that's why you did certain things. But then also the officers, wow, I didn't really understand that perspective before until now on how you viewed our enforcement in the neighborhood. So it's been very meaningful, both internally and externally.
So this is our heads up to the audience here that we've got about 20 minutes for questions. There are a couple of mics here, and if they're not transmitting properly, I'll repeat the question to make sure that it gets to our folks in Stockton. So while you all are coming up with your questions, I'm gonna turn back just to close out with our panel here, and Tashante, maybe we can start with you. Can you just say a quick word, each of you, on where does Stockton go from here? This is a process, obviously. It's not a checkbox. It's not a, we did it, great, that was our 2018 goal, and now that's done. So where do you all go from here as you continue this trust building work?
From my perspective, consistency always knocks out all challenges. And so I feel like from here, as a community member, just my role is to continue to stay connected and to continue to stay connected between both the community members and law enforcement, and continue educating individuals just on the work that needs to be done by us as community members, while also holding law enforcement accountable to continue the journey of building trust and reciprocating those experiences. And again, like I said earlier, consistency, being consistent in the values that come through PJ, and all of the different trainings and experiences that have already been vetted and proven to have worked.
Why don't we go to Captain Meters next, just for a quick, where does Stockton go from here? And then we'll go to Tony and Chief Jones, and then we'll turn to audience questions.
I think for us, and as Tashante had said, I think that consistency becomes critical. We've established a culture where the principles of procedural justice, the trust building work, it's in our general orders, our evaluation system. It's continuing to push that and continue to establish and maintain that culture. And then with our community, it's continuing to build those relationships, and especially reaching out to communities that have gone through trauma, individuals that have gone through trauma, and working with these partnerships to try and get them into a space, whether it's on an individual level with a police officer or in a class or in a trust building workshop, to be able to have a conversation that hopefully can maybe start them down a path that helps them heal and at least starts to rebuild a relationship that may have been damaged by police action.
For me, I'm going to be fully myself here and be very bold. I feel like Stockton is on the vanguard from what it is that I see. I've been here all my life, which is 50 years. And so where do we go from here? I believe that we are poised to set an example of what restoration looks like and trust looks like and reconciliation can be in Black and Brown communities, between the police and the community. I believe that where we're going from here is to walk that example out. I see atonement taking place through the workshops, and there's no excuse that is being made for the history of policing. I see accountability that is being implemented through the chief and through the hierarchy of the officers within law enforcement. You're starting to see the residual of what's being trained internally, externally within the community. And so, I mean, I literally can see the actual transformation taking place. I believe that we still need to continue to be consistent and be, I mean, almost tenaciously consistent so that we don't drop the ball. But I think that if we continue in this direction, where we're going is making a drastic change for a younger generation coming up in front of us, so that the history of policing changes and it doesn't look the same for them as it looks for me and it looked for my grandmother and my grandparents. I believe that we're going in a direction that's going to change the face of policing and within the community, and the history is going to change.
And for me, it's definitely the theme you've heard here. There's this evolution in policing going on, no doubt, and it's sort of in three key areas: enforcement. So we don't do the zero tolerance blanket enforcement anymore. We're much more strategic and data driven in what we do, and getting communities' voice in how they want to be policed. That's critical. The other shift has been in relationships, and through the national initiative. Urban Institute work that's been going on, we have a better idea as to how to build even better relationships than we have, and that's going to be continued efforts, definitely. And the other shift is in metrics. So we've always asked this: how do you measure trust? Such a difficult thing to measure, and we've now got a better idea of how to do that. So I think it's important to continue all of that work going on. And the other thing I think is important is policy. So regardless of departmental leadership, the policy to ensure that this is the way things are for that department going forward are important. So we've had our community advisory board, as well as our practice and policy review committee, which are community members who have examined the themes from the listening sessions and applied them and taken a look, comparing them to our policy, and they're having a voice in what the department's policy is on that. We all do know that culture eats policy for lunch every day. So that's why it's important to infuse these things into the culture of the department, which I think we've had great success in. And it was said earlier, I think is very important by David, that there definitely is a common aspiration. I mean, if all of the different conversations we're having across the nation, really, when everyone comes to the table, we're going to agree on what public safety should look like well over 90% of the time. And it's being able to get to that place, which is, again, often hard work, but it pays off by bringing, like the folks we have here at this table, bringing people to the table that want to be involved, ensuring we're inviting them to the table.
Thank you all so much. I am going to turn this over to our audience for some questions with the time that we've got left.
Thank you very much from Stockton. It's very inspiring, the work that you're doing. I'm representing the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform, Westchester County, New York, and one of our challenges is transparency on the part of police departments in terms of releasing their data. And we feel that that would be a really important step for building community trust. So I'm wondering, Chief Jones, if you could speak about your own policy regarding releasing police data to the public. In 1 year, how many police stops are there? How many police encounters? What are the nature of the encounters? Specifically, do you release data that is disaggregated by race in Stockton, California? And a related question is, if there is a community incident, what is your policy regarding releasing body cam footage? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So certainly transparency is important. And what does transparency mean? Does that mean forthcoming? Does that mean the release of data? For us, certainly we're moving toward releasing more and more data as a police department. We do believe transparency is critical. One of our first steps toward that was putting all of our police policies online. Because they're already subject to public record, why not put them all out there for everyone to see? So that was a big move for us as a police department, which we've done. And we're currently working on being much more open on releasing data. We've been working with the Center for Policing Equity as well on plans on how to do that and how to do that in a smart way. When it comes to body-worn camera footage, we actually have recent legislation here in California, which by July 1st, all police departments and sheriff's agencies across the state will have to release that footage within a certain amount of time, about 45 days, I believe. So we also have a policy currently at Stockton PD is to release that footage, but there's always a balance between evidence and also a compelling public need to see that footage. And those are constant tensions that are just inherent. So, but again, a lot of that is changing anyway throughout the state this summer, where you will be seeing a lot of California agencies releasing body-worn camera footage quite early on, certainly earlier on than has been in the past.
This is Daniela Gilbert. Full disclosure, I worked with Stockton PD for a couple of years. It's great to see you guys on video. So Tony and Tashante and Chief Jones and Captain Metters, you in different ways talked about culture change and the importance of culture change in both of the aspects of this process. And I was hoping you could share a little bit more about what that's looked like and what has worked well in that process and where you think the areas for improvement are.
Want me to start? So, when we talk about police culture and within the training procedural justice, and Chief Jones had mentioned it, talked about cynicism, and it's not a matter of when it's going to happen with police officers. And part of this training and it goes to changing culture is having the conversation around the impact of daily policing on officers, how that affects us, how that teaches us to be less emotional, more controlling, and untrusting. Those are all barriers to creating relationships and partnerships within the community. And it really starts about having that conversation and the impact of those events and how it is that we do this job, how it is that we work with the community, serve a community to the best of our ability. And so part of that culture change is there internally. And then that also goes into changing that culture out on the street. And by having a commitment between community members and police officers in a space to have conversations, that culture now starts looking different on the street. And that when an enforcement action is taken, the officers are encouraged to really give the why. And that transparency many times is directed at the chief and as a head of an organization. But that transparency truly at every level is so important, from an officer to a person that they've had contact with, and the willingness to have a conversation, especially a difficult conversation during an encounter.
For me, the culture change is very apparent, especially coming in and realizing that there was no trauma-informed narrative or conversation going on amongst law enforcement. Not at all. So seeing them become more trauma-informed, taking a more trauma-informed approach when interacting with families and survivors and victims is definitely a shift in culture there. And then from the perspective of a community member on that end, just seeing empowered community members, knowing that their voices matter in these spaces and actually being willing to come into these spaces when that was unheard of before. And so those are two very apparent culture shifts that I see personally.
The culture shift that I'm seeing is one is the officers are approachable for the community. So I'm shifting it from an external lens. The officers are more approachable if there is a concern or a question in regard to why something happened or why is it done this way. There is a space that is now created to have those conversations, whether or not it's uncomfortable or not. What do you call that? Courageous conversations. The other is the communication. And so because there is now the ability to approach, the other culture shift that has changed is there is now communication that is taking place. It is not just one-sided to the community where they felt like the law enforcement was the final say, and there wasn't anything that could be added or input. And so that also then led to a feeling of partnership within the community, that the community now has a presence on the cab in the CAB spaces where they're working on policies, and with the partnership tables where they're able to sit down as a group and with law enforcement and discuss how things are being done and lend their voices, whether or not they're not comfortable with that thing taking place, or what can we do to make that change. I feel like the community is starting to feel like they have more of a voice in what is taking place regarding law enforcement for them.
How you doing? Risco mentioned Lewis, Deputy Police Commissioner of Suffolk County, New York. Quick question. First question is, how do you measure trust? You said you're getting better at that. Do you have a survey you're doing? How are you measuring trust? That's the first question. The second question is the general orders and how you're institutionalizing procedural justice. Would you be willing to share that with other departments? Thank you.
Yes, so thank you, and I'll jump into that. So we're measuring trust a couple different ways. The first one was through the Urban Institute. They came in and went into these communities that we knew had the highest levels of mistrust already. It wasn't a citywide, how does the city feel? We knew we had work to do in certain communities. That's where the time was spent. And they came in with the baseline. You heard earlier today how many of us as police executives knew that distrust was there, just we did not know. And I'll just speak for myself. It was a gut punch to find out how dismal the numbers were. But we knew we were going to be working in the correct areas. And then Urban Institute did a very thorough survey result later to find out improvement had been made. So that was heartening. We're also working with perhaps a company called My90, which does more real time also through cell phone and interactions with the police officers. And they give sort of more immediate, so we can real time gauge how they feel about levels of trust. And then we also, you've heard a lot about CompStat, or you know about CompStat, which is a meeting that most police departments do, whether it be weekly, monthly. They talk about strategies and looking at stats. And instead of just looking at numbers of arrests and citations, we're looking at so many other things, which are, again, number of community engagements and how can we measure that. We often get it anecdotally through stories. Hey, we feel like police are listening more. But two ways we've been measuring is through Urban Institute, which I think did the best job I've seen yet on how to measure trust. And then we're also looking at a sort of a real-time piece that can give us feedback even more quickly to know where trust levels are within our city. And then regarding procedural justice, institutionalizing it into the general orders, we actually had the assistance of both the Center of Policing Equity as well as Yale take a look at our policies and just inject the tenets and the principles of procedural justice through the policies in a number of areas. And then we had our community advisory board as well as the policy and practice community members take a look at our policies, and they've been through PJ procedural justice training and just they've given already some excellent suggestions of where we can thread the language and tenets of procedural justice more significantly through those policies.
Risco wants to know if you'll share the goods.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, this is all about developing best practices for all of us to share.
Hello, my name is Carlos. I have two questions. The question is, historically and statistically, what nationality has done the most mass shootings in America, and why is the false narrative of black people with M&Ms or a hoodie on depicted as a person of violence? The second one is, how or do you reconcile with a bully? And I say that to say, like, coming from a person who was previously incarcerated, growing up in New York City, who's now an outreach worker, trying to stop recidivism of children to going back to jail or getting in trouble. How or do you reconcile with a bully when to them, they look at the police department as bullies, and as a child, how do they deal with it, and do you deal with it? And do the police have that same view? Do you have an answer to that?
Can you restate the first part?
Yeah.
I said historically and statistically, what nationality has done the most mass shootings in the history of America? Also, I said that why is the false narrative of a black person with a hoodie or even with a bag of M&Ms depicted as a person of violence or a threat, when that image has been given to society, but the other one has not been given them, and that was the truth.
Okay, I'll speak to the first part. I can't. One sec.
You could Google it.
I can't give you Yeah, I can't give you exact numbers. My guess is that when you reference mass shootings, that it would be a Caucasian. The history behind why a black male in a black hoodie is seen as being someone that's violent. There's a historical perspective for that. Mr. Shaw spoke to that earlier about lynchings. And when we talk about implicit bias, the idea of black and crime is something that within society is very strong. And that association is carried through history. It's carried through how things are depicted in media, through how one generation shares a story to the next generation. And those are all things that impact the ability to establish a relationship. Speaking to how you reconcile with someone that's a bully, I think the first thing that has to be done is you have to be able to have some sort of a relationship and a common understanding of how each other has been treated, and that's grounded in empathy. I have to be able to understand someone that, let's say, that has been incarcerated. I have to be able to understand um, and give you a voice and listen to the impact of what it was like for someone that has been in that situation, because I have not. And the chief had talked about listening. The listening to that and being able to have empathy around the impact of that event is so crucial. And that's why the training like this is so important for police officers, especially when you start bringing people together.
That's a good answer.
I wanted to speak to the reconciling with the bullying statement. And I want to speak to it from, like I said, an external lens, because I'm not with PD. I don't work with, and I'm more on the outside, and I'm from the street. So with the reconciling with the bullying part, I want to say first, there must be atonement. You can't reconcile with an individual or an entity that is not acknowledging that there's an actual grievance that is taking place. Trust can't even be built or established unless two people are willing to actually reestablish that trust. You can own the fact that something happened, a thing was taking place, but unless you own the fact that there has been an actual grievance, then it's not going, there's no even starting point. And so with the bullying part, if we're using that as an analogy and saying law enforcement has been in a posturing of bullying historically, one, I want to say, based on the history of policing, what I've seen, historically, what I've known, sometimes you can only be a thing that you've been postured and positioned to be. And that thing then rolls out. And where am I going with that? If you look at the history of policing and you look at how it even started and took place, once these uniforms in 2019 have been put on, they put on the uniform of a bully from a historical lens and framing. And so now that I have that understanding, it brings more clarity as to why, when I see the uniform, I automatically see someone that could possibly harm me or hurt me, if the role of the officer was to catch slaves and already dehumanize individuals that have historically, the law implemented says that they're not real. So I don't want to go on a tangent with that. What I do want to make sure that I raise up is that first there has to be acknowledgement, and the bully has to acknowledge that they're actually being bullies. And once they acknowledge that they're being bullies and make atonement and not excuses for that, then the individuals receiving that have to make the choice on whether they're going to forgive and whether they even desire to rebuild trust. That's us then in the community. Do I want to reestablish trust? Do I want to give you an opportunity then to make amends and atonement for the grievances? If I say yes, then we have equal responsibility in partnering together to make that thing happen. And it can only take place if both people says, yes, you were a bully. Yes, you did bully me. Yes, it was wrong. I choose to forgive you. And I am going to work with you alongside and holding you accountable, and you hold me accountable to beginning to reconcile and build a bridge for those that are looking, and walk this thing out as an example.
Is it fair to say, Tony, that part of what you're saying is law enforcement has to go first?
Yes, it is fair to say that law enforcement goes first.
May I add to that?
Sure. And then
so
we've got one more question,
okay.
and then we'll wrap up. But please, Chief.
Okay. This will be quick. So, sort of for me, switching away from a bully perspective, I'm going to go from a positional authority perspective, which goes to exactly what you asked. So, because oftentimes we will hear from law enforcement, well, the community has to also make their acknowledgments of an anti-law enforcement sentiment, or sort of police bashing, or the no snitching norms in communities. And I think what we all know now, or what I believe, is who goes first. Clearly law enforcement, because of this history we're talking about, and the clear positional, the position of power, right, and authority for decades. And then we can begin to, once we broach that, we can begin to have these other discussions of also the community's part, which is important as well.
Okay, last question, and then I will bring David back out and wrap up.
Hi, I'm Kathy. I'm also with the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform, and this has been a perfect segue to my question, which is that we're really impressed with the work you're doing, and in fact pretty jealous to see the kinds of reforms going on in Stockton. And I guess what I'd like to ask is, for those of us who do live in communities that don't have policing leadership that is dedicated to accountability and transparency, or a reform-minded in model and culture, is there hope for us in moving forward first with the kinds of policy shifts that you're seeing in California now, requiring accountability, requiring transparency? Can that come first? Or in the absence of reform-minded leadership, or do we just have to wait? Or maybe find out how to recruit some of you all? Thanks.
This is interesting because we were just talking earlier about everything that I say is going to be governed and centered based on my faith perspective first, always. It is going to be difficult, but it's possible. Policy can make you do a thing. Policy can make you do a thing. Reconciliation and trust cannot be reestablished, even implemented, without that culture shift. However, policy can make you do a thing, and you be held accountable to do a thing because policy says it must be done. But you won't necessarily get that heart change, that behavior change that is needed in order for, God help me, the the humanization of an individual, the heart. The people in our communities need to know that the officers that wear these uniforms really care about us, and really care about our well-being. Um, Not because they're made to do it, because policy said they had to. Policy can enforce it being done in a specific way. But if that heart is not there and you still see me as as an animal or less than or beneath, um, policy cannot make you change the tone and the manner in which you speak. It cannot make you respect me. It cannot make you have trust, make me feel like you're trustworthy, or that there is neutrality. The principles of policing that are being implemented are being implemented successfully to the degree that they are, because the culture, the heart of the leadership, and the heart of those that are bought into this is infiltrating into that culture, the DNA of Stockton PD. And it makes it difficult for a bad apple to exist in a space where that culture is like, well, man, what are you doing? Why did you speak to that individual that way? Because then internally they hold each other accountable. Policy can make you do a thing, but if your heart's not in it, man, it makes it difficult for the people to trust you.
One thing I would say on, how do you bring this work to there? We were lucky enough last month in February. We brought several cities from across the country here to Stockton to do work. In fact, for 5 days we did work around procedural justice, trust building. Tashante and Tony McNeil actually were part of a class, part of a panel, working with instructors from around the country on how to do this. And within New York, there's two from Albany PD, one of which I believe is in the room with you today, that were a part of that training. And I think when you're looking, how do you build this work there within, New York? There are resources that are there where you can start that. And I know from the trainers that were there that they had the same drive and passion we do around this work and around creating these relationships.
I'll say that there's hope already being manifested because you are in this space and you are in the room, you're at the table, being a part of the conversation, and you have now been exposed to the reality of what it could look like. So of course there's evidence of hope there. And then in regards to bringing it to your own communities, it makes me think about Tupac, where he says that he might not be the one to change the world, but he definitely will be the one to spark it. So maybe it's being you can spark it. You can approach your chief and request a courageous conversation, a one-on-one between yourself and that chief. That's what I did. And then allow the universe and God to direct the rest of the path. And so there's definitely hope, and you may be the spark.
Thank you all so much. We're going to wrap up there. That was an absolutely perfect note to end on, and I'm going to reintroduce David Kennedy.
So I am going to close with just a couple of thoughts, but before I do that, I want to offer some heartfelt thanks. So to all of the several panelists who've shared with you today, can I have one final round of thank you? Once again, to the National Initiative folks at the National Network who've been doing the work that you've just had a glimpse of. I hope you agree with me that this is pretty extraordinary stuff. And just a few years ago, we could not have been looking at this. So thanks to the people who've gotten us this far. And today, thanks again to Veronica Dunlap and Tia and Asa2 and Tristan and all the folks at Strategic Initiatives here in my office who have made today happen. Thank you. So the panel just ended with a conversation about how to move this work along. And there are lots of ways to move this work along. There's advocacy, there's system reform, there's, at least there used to be consent decrees. There'll probably be consent decrees again at some point. The national network has its own niche here. And the national network has always proceeded by seeing an opportunity to address something significant, finding willing partners, developing that work on the ground, and then having developed it, been able to point at it and say, this is real, it has to change the way we think and the way we act. And I believe we are to that point with what, again, I will say we use as a placeholder, this reconciliation work, this trust building work. I sit in rooms, I sat in a room recently in which people of extremely goodwill talked at length about their inability to address the alienation between communities and specifically police in their cities. And they said, we've done everything we know how to do. We've had the community meetings. We've had coffee with cops. We relaunched our police athletic league. We have the Citizen Police Academy. We do ride-alongs. Nothing's working. And those things will never work. We know they will never work because they do not get to what is true. And what is true is that policing in this country has been a long expression of white supremacy and other forms of deliberate and structured oppression under color of law. That's just true. We've been speaking mostly about African American experiences in communities, but when we began this work in Minneapolis, the first conversation we had, there was a gay man at the table, and he said, remember that for us, Stonewall is not just the launch of gay liberation. Stonewall was gay men in New York City finally having had enough with being extorted by the New York City Police Department. And I do this stuff for a living, and I did not know this history, but he did, which is that it was common practice at the time for NYPD to go into the gay clubs in this city where we now sit and tell all the men there, give us everything you've got, empty your pockets, or we will ruin your life. And Stonewall was the moment where those folks would not put up with that anymore. And also at that table was an American Indian gentleman who said, my people have been done more grievously than any, and by the way, I was shot 7 times at Wounded Knee, so I know what I'm talking about. There is no reckoning with those facts that does not include a reckoning with those facts. We have to do this work. And you've just gotten a taste of what we now know at some level to be possible because we and others are doing this work. And what we see a step or 2 or 3 steps away, in which people of goodwill tell the truth to each other. My faith friends talk about the power of the word. And the telling of truth and atonement and reckoning has an innate power. And I was in the room when in Birmingham, Alabama, then Police Chief A.C. Roper sat with what Birmingham calls the foot soldiers, those still there who marched and bled with Martin Luther King. And he had his first acknowledgement and listening session with the foot soldiers. And he sat at a table with them and said, "This department did you terrible wrong. You are on the right side of history. We are on the wrong side of history. I sit still in my office with the surveillance files that the Birmingham Police Department kept on all of you back then. So I can never forget what we did. And I am wearing the uniform of the Birmingham Police Department, and as the institution in front of you right now, I tell you that it was wrong and I apologize for what we did." And one of the most venerable of the foot soldiers looked at him and said, "That's right, you did us wrong." And we've been waiting to hear this ever since, and now that you have said it, I will say to you that I sat with Martin Luther King and talked about the time when you would be the chief of police in Birmingham, Alabama. And we all looked at each other because A.C. Roper is not old enough for that to have happened. And this is the letter from the Birmingham jail. That man sat with Martin Luther King in the Birmingham jail and said, "One day the Birmingham Police Department will have a black police chief." And that foot soldier looked at Chief A.C. Roper and said, "We have to make this work." You can't do that by statute. You can't do it by civilian review board. You can't do it by policy. But what we see nascent all across the country are folks on both sides of this who are willing to do the work of facing facts and doing better. And we wanted to give you a taste of that today, and we invite you to stay with us as we do this work. Thank you very much.